everybody for joining us and for joining us in all the different parts of the world that you are in. So for those of you for whom this is the first time you've been to a Liviana session, welcome. And for those of you who are coming back to Liviana, either you've been to something earlier in the week or you're coming back after last year, also welcome to Liviana. So just a couple of things to note. The session is being recorded and we do have a YouTube channel where we put the recordings from Liviana. So if you've got any concerns about that, you can email Tom, who's the Liviana coordinator this year. A little note there about keeping your microphone on mute and using the chat for questions and comments. And if you'd like to put in the chat anything about who you are and what part of the world you're in, you could do that just at the beginning. That would be great. And we just, try to engage with kindness and respect. So this session, well, it's an auspicious day to be having a session on diverse democracies. And we gave Josh a few options of the timing. And he said, I think now's a good time because it'll give me something to focus on other than the results that will start coming out possibly, within a couple of hours. We'll see how things go with that. And the other person I want to thank, I'm not sure, I can't see who's joining us, is Mariana Gonzalez, who was working with Josh at People Powered. And in 2022, she did the summer winter school that the Community Economies Institute runs. And she said, oh my gosh, I can see some really interesting parallels between the work that People Powered does and the work that the Community Economies Institute does. So we've been, having conversations for a couple of years now. And this is our first step towards concretely doing something together. So it is this bit of a conversation between People Powered as an organisation and the Community Economies Institute as an organisation. And it's come about because Josh has written this white paper, and I will in a moment put the white paper, the link to it, into the chat. And it's a white paper from waves to ecosystem, the next stage of democratic innovation. And this really builds on Josh's work for 20 years related to participatory democracy programs, including work on participatory budgeting that he's been involved in around 30 cities in the US. And I keep pressing the down button or the across button to get to the next slide. And for some reason, I'm not getting to the next slide, which is going to show you the times, how long we've got to do things. So if it's not working by pressing down or the right button, there we go, got it. So we've got Josh who's going to talk for 20 minutes. I'll stop sharing my screen in a moment and Josh will share his screen. Then we're going to have about 5-6 minutes each from Anna, Inés, Heras and Katherine Gibson, who are on the board of the Community Economies Institute. And that's an organisation that we call, instead of an NGO, we think of ourselves as a NUERO, a non-university education and research organisation. And then we'll have some time for some Q&A or some comments after that. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'll hand over to Josh.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone, and I'm excited about this session on a very interesting day for democracy. Let's put the link in the chat to the white paper as well. And so what I'll do is I'll briefly introduce People Powered in our work and then talk about the white paper and some of the overlap between, I think, the diverse economies and diverse democracies or democratic ecosystems work. And yeah, eager to learn with you all. So I'm going to share my screen. And feel free to put any questions in the chat as we're going along. I'm glad to come back to them afterwards. Can you see my screen okay? Fantastic. So I'm based in New York. I'm co-executive director of People Powered. We're a global hub for participatory democracy. But I'll be speaking about a white paper that I wrote as an individual called From Waves to Ecosystems, the Next Stage of Democratic Innovation, although it connects very closely with our work. And briefly, as far as people-powered, so we are a global organization. Our mission is to expand people's power to make government decisions. So beyond elections, looking at the wide array of practices of democracy beyond elections. And the way we do that is by supporting organizations and governments that are building participatory democracy around the world. So we're kind of like a global union for participatory democracy workers, people on the ground who are working to transform how government works and make it more participatory. When I say participatory democracy, I mean things that some of you, I imagine, will be aware of, others maybe less experience in, but different ways for people to decide on public budgets, laws, policies, so things like participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies, participatory planning, policy making, a wide range of practices there. And last slide, in people-powered, the way we do this work, so there's, on one hand, we do a lot of public-facing work. The way we would talk about it is accelerating transitions to a more participatory democracy, basically making it easier for governments and organizations to adopt more participatory governance and decision-making, connecting them with the resources and people that they need to do that, and reducing friction, making that whole process easier. The way we do that is from below. We're a membership-based organization. Our members are the local and national organizations, civil servants, advocates who are supporting participatory democracy on the ground. And so we serve as a vehicle for them to provide training, mentorship, develop resources to help do more together. So onto the white paper, and I think where it gets more interesting for some of your work potentially. So this is a white paper that I wrote that was commissioned by the Biden School of Public Policy Administration and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. And really, it was my effort to reflect back a lot of what I'm hearing from other people in the field of democratic innovation, participatory democracy, deliberative democracy. So I'm trying to give words to things, but I won't claim that all the ideas are mine. There's just a lot of discussion happening in the space, and wanted to hopefully steer it in a productive discussion. So I'll start out actually with a pretty basic question. I'd love your answers in the chat. Do you live in a democracy? Take a second. I'm curious what, let me see if I can view the chat. Do you live in a democracy? A basic question, one we should be able to answer in a day like today. I hope so. Yes, yes. Somehow, yes. Officially, a very limited one. Yeah, so to me, this is an interesting question because the way it's structured, we talk about democracy like it's something that you can live in. Like democracy is a house. You can live in a house, you can live in a democracy, and it's a clear physical thing that you can reside within, that we all know what it means. And I think that's a question to challenge. Like, are elections the same conceptually as a house, something that we can be confined within? A lot of people working on democracy say yes. And so the Economist Intelligence Unit says that 45% of the world lives in a democracy, 55% does not. You can kind of divide it up based on some criteria. The ultimate, or the general criteria is, are there free and fair elections? And so that's the most common way of defining this. The reason I think this question is especially interesting now is because most people don't think they live in a democracy around the world. That the majority of people in electoral democracies think that their political system needs major changes or needs to be completely reformed. Most people don't think they have influence on government decisions. And research has shown that elections have provided economic elites, business groups with oversized influence. And so we have really compelling evidence that this kind of monolithic system of elections isn't delivering the democracy people expect. And we're seeing people turn to authoritarianism, rejecting this political system, seeing what else is out there, and finding the offer from authoritarian parties and leaders more appealing. So for me, this is a really existential threat that if we don't change how we talk about democracy, then we are losing democracy and losing this battle to anti-democratic forces. So there's three main things I tried to do in the white paper. All of them point at how we can renew democracy and move beyond some of these limitations. So first, and I'll walk through these in more detail in a bit, is to expand what we mean by democracy, how we understand democracy, by revisiting its diverse past and present. Second is to shift from what I call competing waves of democracy to instead building balanced democratic ecosystems. And I really owe a big debt here to Jacob Gibson Graham and the analogy of the iceberg, and that changed my conception of ideas like economy and democracy and seeing the different ways they're practiced. And third is that I think we need to support that transition. How do we move from one system to another? And mainly I outlined some kind of unhealthy habits and strategies that we can do that, some very concrete things. I'm curious your thoughts on them. So another quick question, does anyone know what this is? You can say put in the chat too. Ideally, anyone who hasn't read the white paper, but any ideas are welcome. Does anyone know what this is? You can go off mute too, I suppose, if you want to shout it out. Maybe a voting tool. Something for counting sortition instruments. Yep, these are all correct. So this is an Athenian claritarion. So this is kind of the original voting machine in a sense, but also beyond voting. It's the original instrument, an original instrument of democracy in ancient Athens. And we think about and often talk about Athens as this holy birthplace of democracy. What they meant by democracy is very different from what we typically mean now. For people in ancient Athens, democracy was the solution to the problem of elections. So elections were the problem, democracy was the solution. The elections had repeatedly led to charismatic people having overdue influence, and so they decided to practice democracy differently. This tool was used to basically you put these little tokens representing each citizen in the different slots, and then using dice, you randomly selected a row of citizens to serve on the governing council. So it was a tool for sortition, which they used alongside direct democracy, having a more popular assembly, people could vote on policies, and also elections. So recognizing there's different ways for people to practice democracy. And stepping back, this is one of different diverse ways that people have practiced democracy over time. We tend to get stuck on what's happening now, but there's a much longer history. As far back as 4000 BC, there were neighborhood councils in ancient Mesopotamia, where people were deciding at the local level democratically. We then see this rise of ancient deliberative and direct democracy in ancient Athens. What we talk about as democracy now is relatively recent. Modern electoral democracy only really took off after the American and French revolutions. Even then, it was a slow build-up. We've also seen in the 20th century and beyond, modern direct democracy, whether it's town hall meetings in the US or in Switzerland, people directly deciding on policies. And then in the 60s, this participatory turn throughout society, which included and then led to things like participatory budgeting and more participatory planning approaches. And now we're seeing a deliberative wave of deliberative democracy using sortition, random selection to bring people together to deliberate and make recommendations. And waves, I think, are interesting and can be very powerful, but also have some problems. So one is they lead to groupthink, that when you're on the top of that wave, that's all you see. And you think that's the entire world, and you become less aware of some flaws or some challenges. Second is that waves are competitive. They don't combine very well together. Two waves, when they crash into each other, cancel each other out, and they don't build up. And third, that waves aren't sustainable. Often they get built up so high with very lofty expectations and then come crashing down when those expectations aren't met, and then people move on to the next big thing. So what I'm proposing is actually inspired very much by the diverse economies framework, which kind of went beyond this one system. I know this is an old image now. This is what I read back in grad school a long time ago, but stuck with me for the imagery, which I think is really powerful. So recognizing that there's this one approach, or capitalism in this case on top, and a lot more beneath the surface. The same is true for democracy. But also I think a different kind of analogy can be more useful, at least for the case of democracy. I'm curious your thoughts on this for economy as well. So the way I thought about this is more as ecosystems of democracy, where you can have different democratic practices that actually work together in an interconnected way, including with that kind of dominant model of elections in the case of democracy. And the reason for this, or the benefits of this, one is that ecosystems are more diverse, so you can have different practices that combine together in useful ways. They're interconnected, which makes them more resilient. So if there's a shock to the system, it can better absorb that by deflecting that in different ways. And they're also dynamic. They change over time. So as people's expectations change, as technology changes, ecosystems are able to adapt. So what I'm proposing is that we shift from thinking about these competing in different waves and instead integrating them into ecosystems of democracy that are more functional and stronger. And briefly, I won't go into details, but this is happening around the world at a small scale still, but it's happening. So in Paris, for example, they have a randomly selected citizens assembly that chooses the theme for the city's participatory budgeting process, and also then connects for city council and makes it stronger and more representative of the community. So they're working to connect these together. We've seen this at the national level in Brazil right now, where there's a new participatory platform that's combining multi-year planning, policy making, public consultations, digital democracy, and trying to learn the lessons also from the past that led to Bolsonaro. So we see seeds of this, and I think we need to have a more fundamental transition and be very thoughtful about the strategy for that. For that, I draw an inspiration from the just transition framework that's been adopted especially by climate activists, although it goes beyond climate, recognizing that we're currently in this extractive economy that relies on extraction of resources. And we need to transition to a renewable economy and society and government as well. And that requires big changes. And those changes must be done in a just way, recognizing the sacrifices people make. If someone's working in a coal factory and they have to lose their job, how do we have them still have a job? So it's a very hard process. This is the more practical part of the white paper, is looking at how do we get there? What do we do? And for me, I find it helpful to think about unhealthy habits. What are things that we're doing now that are getting in the way of this ecosystem building? And then what are things that we're doing that can support this? So there's kind of five unhealthy habits that I'm seeing out there in the democracy space, at least, that are limiting our democracy. So the first is solutionism, the belief that one single solution can solve all of our problems. Most people in the democracy space are very strong advocates for one particular approach. And that gets in the way of other approaches and gets in the way of collaboration when all you can see is one approach. So it's the kind of tech solutionism, like click here to solve everything. We see that all over the democracy space. A second is conflation. That's where people talk about democracy, but in the sense that only means my approach to democracy. So a lot of groups kind of claiming this term, often in their name or events, and in a way that suggests that this is all there is of democracy, and can be very alienating for other groups who don't see themselves then in that picture. A third is rigidity, the idea that my democratic practice must follow a specific formula and anything else is wrong. And we see this a lot, especially with global north-based advocates or organizations who have developed a process that may work great in Germany, and they set boundaries on how other people can adapt that to make it work for their context. And that gets in the way of broader spread and experimentation. Fourth is abstraction. I think this would also apply in the economic space. People saying that they're like pro-democracy or I suppose anti-capitalist, and not really being clear what that means, and just using it as a term that becomes so broad that it's devoid of meaning. And the fifth is division. So this belief and practice that my democracy work is fundamentally different and separate from yours. I'm working on elections or ranked choice voting, and you're working on citizens' assemblies. We have nothing in common. And that's preventing us from having a broader pro-democracy movement in a way that anti-democracy activists aren't being hindered in that way. They're coming together more powerfully. And then just to close out, some strategies for growing democratic ecosystems, like what can we do? What is working? There's a lot that's working out there. So one is to build bridges, experimenting with new ways to combine or link democratic practices, like the example I gave in Paris, where there's a direct linkage between one practice and another. The Citizens Assembly helps decide the theme for participatory budgeting. It makes them both stronger. So that's the kind of institutional design linkage. Second is to share infrastructure. So for governments to have common staffing and support for different democratic practices, rather than what's often project-based. So they'll set up a team for a citizens assembly or for participatory planning, and they will be separate, and that makes it more costly, more expensive, and harder for them to integrate as well. Naming a common enemy, and this is maybe a more controversial one, but I think often in the democracy space, people focus a lot of their attention on people who agree with 95% of what they say, but not the other 5%. And so we focus on these slight differences between approaches to democracy, as opposed to the much more powerful forces who are trying to do away with democracy entirely. And I think we need to be very clear about what the biggest threats are. And it's not your approach versus my approach to democracy. It's people who want elite rule and are explicitly against democracy. The side of that is to reframe what we're for and developing shared language to communicate what democracy is and could be. I don't think we're great at this right now. And a lot of the language around this is very wonky and doesn't appeal to people on the ground, and doesn't appeal across different approaches or across different groups. And the last one, and this draws on the Just Transitions work, is to invest in training that transition piece. That it's not going to be transition by force of the best ideas. It's a lot of work. It's talking with people. It's accompanying them. And there's no shortcut for that. That you need to actually retrain politicians, civil servants, advocates to shift their roles. And that's a long-term process, not just an intellectual one. So yeah, just to sum up, these are the main things that I'm hearing from people in the democracy field and wanting to reflect back to help us move forward, to expand our understanding of democracy by revisiting its past and present, shift from these competing waves to instead building balanced democratic ecosystems, and then to be smarter about how we support that just transition for democracy by cutting down on some of the specific habits that are unhealthy, that are getting in the way, and adopting new strategies. And I think that's it. So I think that was actually 20 minutes. I did it. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Josh. And yes, spot on 20 minutes and wonderfully clear and well organised, and a great introduction to the white paper. So thanks so much for that. We're now going to hear a little bit from Inés Heras and then Kath Gibson. So we might start with Anna first. And Anna is in Argentina and very active in the struggle there at the moment. And she's on the founding member of the chair of, or on the board of the Community Economies Institute. And Anna just has a piece out today in the Global Tapestry of Alternatives newsletter on working in collaboration. So while Anna's talking, I'll put a link to that piece that Anna's just done into the chat so people can follow that up if they're interested. So Anna, I'll tell you when 6 minutes is up. How does that sound?
Muy bien, gracias. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I told Jenny that I was shooting for 5 minutes as she asked me for, but maybe I will be a little over 5 minutes. I thought about responding to Josh's paper and the two themes that were asked about, which were what are similarities and differences between what Josh is bringing for us to see and what we do at the Community Economies Institute. And secondly, I will go over things that I think we can learn from what Josh has posed and maybe contribute as well to his work. In terms of what I found similar, I found very similar the approach to inventorying practices and building from that a sort of map, and then also doing reading for difference in the sense that each of the practices that he was identifying over time, actually over a long spread of time, could be looked at each other and find what may be common with each other and what may be different. So in that process, I found that similar to the methodology we use in community economies. And I also found concepts that were very similar as well, such as defining ecologies as interconnected. We may use interdependence, but it's very similar, diversity, dynamism. So in those senses, I found similarities. I also found similar that the concepts are built through the analysis. So when you get to the interpretation, moving from waves to ecologies, I found that you were building it up as you were progressing, which is also similar to what we do, I think. And fourthly, I think that a place where things may be combined differently if we were to work together in a project, say, would be the approach of ethnography or anthropology based more in thick description and also analysis of interaction. I don't have time to expand now, but in Argentina, we did have our wave of participatory democracy, and I coordinated a big project whereby we looked at specific places which these processes were taking place. And what we found through observing and conversing and participating directly was very interesting in, so to speak, contrast to what was being said that the process was all about. So that's something I leave there for opening if people feel like they would want to. In terms of what can we learn, I thought at least about 3 things we could learn, probably many more, but at least 3. Which are, the first one is to pose and debate uncomfortable questions. As a matter of fact, I spoke with you over email about the fact that, for example, given that the US has intervened Latin America repeatedly, so that's a question that opens up for me. But the way I thought I could frame it is, would it be the case that certain ecologies to exist may need to dominate other ecologies? So I leave it as that as a question, which is an uncomfortable question, I think, but one I think we need to ask, or at least it helped me to read your paper and listening to you. I was thinking about this again. The second thing is that I think it helps to identify processes that not necessarily people would say, oh, yes, this is democracy happening. By way of example, in Argentina, at the university and at the National Council of Science of Research, we're undergoing a terrible process because it's being defunded. And so we're mobilizing and marching and assembling every single week. And so if I were to ask people, is this, what does this have to do with Argentinian democracy now? Probably they wouldn't make the link, but I think that there's a lot to look at there, and probably it would inform us as to how to expand the notion of democracy. And thirdly and lastly, and this, what I'm going to say is very loco, as we say in Argentina, but I'll say it anyhow, way out there, which is, I was thinking we could take all the bibliography and production that the Economies Institute has put together and look backwards and read it through the democracy lens. What I mean by that is that probably people who were doing, for example, research on how an urban garden provided for food for people were not maybe looking at democratic processes, but they might have documented that with different categories, different ways of looking at it. And in reading it again, reading either the text or their databases from this lens, we could find different things, I think. I know it sounds, like I said, very local or very out there to say, let's go back and reread everything under this lens. But I got myself thinking to do that. And as we say in Argentina, I'm un poquito delirante, meaning I can be delirious. So 5 minutes, spot, ciao, listo, perfecto. Pass the word.
Anna, well done. Thank you so much for that. and given us some great starting points for things that we might come back to in the discussion. And maybe, Josh, we could even pick that off by you responding to some of the things that Anna's just raised in what she said. So I'll now hand over to Kath Gibson, who is co-chair of the Community Economies Institute. And I should have said that Kath and Anna were both asked to respond to Josh's talk, both in terms of the connection with community economies and diverse economies work, and also in how we're thinking about the Community Economies Institute as this non-university education and research organisation. So Kath, I'll hand over to you and I'll let you know when 6 minutes is up if you're still going.
Okay. Great, thanks Jenny, and thanks Josh. It's wonderful to have you with us and presenting your white paper, and thanks Anna for those great comments. Yeah, I just want to pick up on one quote that you included in the white paper from Theodore Roosevelt, of all people, who said, and you quoted this, "There can be no political democracy unless there's something approaching economic democracy." And I guess that's the kind of point of connection I feel between community economies and people-powered. And, you know, in our work, we went back to that moment that Marx talked about, or that moment in the working men's sort of movement of the late 19th century, when the choice was made to go with getting men the rights to vote and political democracy, as opposed to go the cooperative model of economic democracy and trying to increase the ability to have control over the means of production. And, you know, I think there was a lost opportunity at that very point when things could have gone either way, and we've written about that. And the attempt to then keep economic democracy on the agenda has been something that's been very difficult, I think, within the left and within in general. So I feel like what the community economies work is doing is, again, doing that kind of not just looking at the diversity, but trying to find those moments in the world where some form of economic democracy is taking place. It's particularly around ethical negotiations of issues around surplus, how it's produced and distributed, how we organise labour and what living well means, how we engage with exchange, you know, how we deal with property and how we invest in the future. And these are the kind of elements or the focus of a lot of the community economies, empirical research and also action research. So to us, in a way, I suppose ethical negotiation is a surrogate for economic democracy. It is the practice of discussion and decision about economic futures. So it's where I feel like people are practicing getting experience in the process of democratic decision making, as well as in all the places that you're talking about, which are much more related to public policy planning, this kind of thing. And there was a few points where there's a nexus between bringing that back to having more say over economic issues as well. And I think that's some area where you could really explore further. Because the question of the practice of doing this is the issue. How do we actually get enacted? How do we become the subjects that can ethically negotiate and take decisions in different ways? So the affinities between the thinking, I think Anna's brought out very well, and diverse democracies, diverse economies, and then within that diverse democracy picture, finding where participatory democracy is really happening. And for us, it's finding within the diverse economy where actually community economies are really happening, where ethical economic action takes place. And then you've moved to this idea of trying to build ecosystems. And I think in our work, certainly something I've been thinking about recently is how do we come up with assemblages that are transformational, that actually build together these ethical actions. And I've been thinking about the way in which community economies interacts with the social and solidarity economy, with the commoning movement, with movements for decommodification, such as the foundational economy, you know, the peasant food web, decolonization of assets. So these kinds of, they've all got separate politics to some extent, or separate movements, and yet I'd love to see community economies being more of a hub for that kind of connection that you're talking about. You have a participatory democracy hub. I think there's a need for more of a hub around how do we enact economic democracy, you know, directly. But that's where I think we can learn from what you've done and perhaps what you're doing now to build that ecosystem, because looking at your reports and your strategic plans from the last few years, it's just amazing how your organization has been able to develop and build connections to other international organizations that are interested in similar things. And so I'm really interested in how you've done that, and whether it's organizational connections that are helping build the ecosystem. Yeah, I mean, and isn't that's going to lead to the participatory democracy ecosystem? Or what is your kind of strategy? I didn't look at the strategy plan, but and to what extent is staffing something that really is crucial? To what extent is it the financial aspect that you've been able to access, and how? And the fact that you've got so many organizational members of your organization. And we've just gone through an exercise trying to document the sort of impact of our work in terms of where people, non-academic impact that is, in terms of where people are working with what organizations. And, you know, it's a huge number, but we've never tried to mobilize them as members of a Community Economies Institute. We've stayed within the realm of people still being active researchers within the Institute. But it seems your organization is very much connected to other organizations. And I'd love to hear more about how you've conceptualized that strategy. So I think I'll end it there. I'm just interested to hear more about the organizational framework and how that we could learn from that too. So thanks.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Kath. So maybe while people are sort of assembling their thoughts, we might, Josh, give you a chance to respond to some of the things that Anna raised, and also some of the things that Kath raised. And maybe if you've got a question, just type your name in the chat so that I can just keep track of who's wanting to ask a question or a comment for Josh. Okay, so Josh, I'll hand it back to you now.
Fantastic. Yeah, those are great responses. Could talk for a whole hour probably about that, but maybe I'll pick on a few of the key things that maybe are more productive or interesting. So to build on what Anna was saying about, I think one of the points that came through for me is how do we kind of learn and bridge with social movements, and the fact that people may be protesting or organizing around their university, you know, the distance between that and what they might think of as democracy or governance. I think there's a lot of productive space between that. And even if we're talking about things like assemblies, that right now there's a kind of professional participatory democracy wave, this deliberative wave of citizens' assemblies. But also assemblies are something people have done in lots of different formats over time. And those are often two different discussions, the kind of informal and the formal to some extent. And this is one of the areas I talk about in the white paper of how do we bridge these different practices and spaces and logics. That I think part of that is by bringing people together who are doing different practices and creating the conditions where they can see some of the overlap, as we're doing here even. We're actually, I'll put in a link in the chat, we're having a session next week from now, on this, on how to kind of remix different democratic practices. And one of the speakers will be specifically talking about this idea of how do we bring together the different kinds of assemblies, from social movement assemblies to sortition bases and assemblies. And what can we learn from the different sides? What can the protest movement assemblies learn from democratic deliberation practices and vice versa? So that's one thing that stood out, and that I think is a concrete area for more exploration, is bringing together these kind of unlikely or unknowing partners that are doing something similar, and to have that productive discussion. Another is, I think, connecting the kind of democratic and economic alternative ecosystems, or diverse democratic and economic ecosystems. And I've seen this in lots of spaces, usually at a pretty small level. So actually, like when I was living in Argentina before, in Rosario, the city's participatory budgeting program had a policy that projects had to first be offered to cooperatives and small enterprises based in the neighborhoods before they were offered to larger businesses. So if they were building a new playground, it would first go towards a local cooperative or a local small business to do that. And that directed a lot of money towards the social economy and towards cooperatives in ways that are hard to do otherwise, like using the power of the state. In Boston, there's the Center for Economic Democracy that is one of our members that's been doing great work around community financing as well, and building kind of participatory economic management practices. So I think there's a few nexes there. And then, I mean, the whole organizational staffing structures, all of that, that's maybe like a deeper discussion. And that's, I'm not in academia now, I was before. I'm definitely I gravitate more towards building organizations and how do we bring together the right set of staff, of partners, of members, which is just a different skill set and area of work than some of the theory building or research work. I think we need all kinds, that in an orchestra, you need people playing different instruments, and that we don't all have to be the lead violinist. You can have, I think it's really important to recognize what your strengths are and build on that. And that's how I approach partnerships too, is seeing what each partner can bring to the table. So for example, for a research institute, one of the things that we're working on, actually my colleague Ryan Garang, who's on the call as well, is working on compiling the impact data on participation. So what are the impacts of all these great processes that we talk about? And when do they have more impact and less impact? That's something that we need researchers to do. That's the practitioners are less equipped to do that. So that's an example, I think, of a good fit, I would say, rather than trying to necessarily build up a big staff or a practice organization. The fact that a lot of you are based at universities and have those research connections can be a great asset. And groups like People Powered can help to put that into practice more. But I'm going to stop talking because I'd love to hear from other people on the call.
Right. So there's no one who's put anything in the chat. But if anyone wants to just launch into a question or a comment, that would be great. Okay, Tom, thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on well, thanks for the 3 contributions. I really enjoyed them. And one of the phrases that just sort of stuck out to me, and I just wondered if you could expand on it a bit more, was retraining politicians, and what that sort of process looks like from your organization's perspective, and what potential and examples you could bring of that.
Yeah, maybe Molly, do you want to ask a question too, and then we can go around and build on that?
Yep. Kia ora, thank you. That was such an interesting presentation, Josh. Thank you. I just had a question because I noticed you had legislative theatre on your first slide as something you're involved with. I'd just really love to know more about what you're doing with that approach.
Great. Yeah, I guess I can start with those, and if someone else wants to add a question as well. For retraining politicians, that's hard. I mean, I wouldn't say that we've figured that out by any means. There's a lot of efforts now to have kind of leadership incubators for new politicians. So I guess the key being the intervention moment is when someone first comes into office. So it's not necessarily retraining the politician who's been there for 40 years, but retraining the kind of new generations of politicians at a point when they're most receptive to that training and helping them. So for example, having workshops that help them to learn about different participatory practices that they could bring into office when they're elected. And if you get them early, and even if you get them through like formal programs, ideally like through policy schools, you know, and both politicians, I would say, and policymakers or people who are like leading work in government agencies are equally important. I think those are two of the main things I've seen, of like get them early when they're starting out. Not to say that we can't all relearn and like learn new tricks throughout life, but like you have the most bang for the buck when people are starting out and they're more receptive and looking for anything that can get them ahead. And then to, yeah, have kind of training academies, frankly. And this is what like the right does pretty well. Like they have free retreats in this mountain resort where you can come learn about all the best ways to dismantle, you know, the safety net and to dismantle government programs. And so I think we could do a lot more of that, letting people know about this work, because they're not going to read a paper. And it's much more engaging for them. Isn't it too late when they come into office? Yeah, I mean, ideally even before when they're candidates is a great time. So having, there's some of our members have programs, or one of our members in Colombia, Instituto, has a program, Ocupar la Política, where before coming into office, they work with a cohort of candidates to build up a kind of approach to participation that runs through them and that's more deeply seated, so that when they come into office, they bring that and they have some accountability as well from that. And then as far as legislative theater, are we asking what the practice is or what we're doing on it?
What you're doing with it. So I know what the practice is, and I've seen a couple of examples here. It's not very common. I'm in New Zealand, but I know about it. I'm from a background, but I'd love to know what you think. Yeah,
it's not common. I'm guessing most people on the call don't know what it is. So I'll just briefly say that it's a practice that also emerged out of Brazil, like participatory budgeting, that uses theater to develop new laws based on kind of community problems and situations of oppression. And so basically, you bring together people in a community to act out a situation of oppression. So let's say that they're getting kicked out of their housing. And then they work with them to act that out, intervene, and think of policy solutions where they identify a policy that could avoid that eviction, prevent that eviction. And it's less common than some of the other participatory practices. I find it really exciting because it taps into people's emotions and bodily experiences more. It's not based on this kind of Western European notions of rational deliberation. It's based on like, what are you living? And how can we start there? And if you start there, it's much more accessible and you get great ideas when people like literally are acting out what they're experiencing and acting out other ways they might experience that. So yeah, I think it's super transformative and can teach us a lot about other methods as well. How do we bring fun and people's emotions and physical experiences and bodies into this space, not just their rational intellect? So it's one of the main practices we support. And so we have like accelerator programs that help people launch legislative theater. We offer mentorship in that, have some resources to help people design legislative theater programs. So like for all of our work, the basic idea is making it easier for someone to learn about that, see how it could fit their context, and then do it and do it well.
That's great. Really fantastic. Thank you, Josh. I will.
So Melissa's got her hand up. So Melissa, do you want to give your question or comment? Thanks.
Thank you. Great talk by everyone. There's been a lot of talk in the urban planning about the disruptive role in bots in participatory planning. So overcoming like discussion forums and community surveys to disrupt urban planning processes. So I was wondering if that's something that you've encountered or have any thoughts on.
That is super interesting. I would love to read more about that. It's definitely one of the biggest issues in the space now is the role of AI, generative AI in particular. I think we're really at early stages now. A lot of work is being done in that. It's a very kind of unsettled field, both on the side of how can bots or AI enable this work and where can it actually facilitate participation, and then also obviously what are the threats from that. So I've seen some great examples actually. Carolyn Hagelskamp was also on the call, was sharing an example with me before of, I think, a participatory budgeting process that uses AI to match people up who have similar proposals. So if you're proposing, say, a park bench for the streets, they'll say, this other person is proposing another improvement for the streets. Maybe you can meet together and develop something that's a bigger project that could get funded. That seems like a great use. And that's actually hard and very labor intensive to do otherwise, and often just doesn't happen, or usually doesn't. So there's a lot of potential there, but yeah, I think we need to explore that much more and to test things out and be really careful, and glad to see what you've been learning as well from that.
Okay, so Kath, yep.
Yeah, I couldn't find the other hand thing. I'd use my real hand. I'm interested to hear maybe from Ryan as well, how you're going about doing the impact work, because it seems like maybe that also links into Anna's interest in ethnography, that to some extent, are you taking that kind of qualitative approach to the process, and also like over what period are you looking at an impact? Because I'm thinking we're now looking back at work we've done 20 years ago, which, you know, at the time you thought, oh, that, you know, that community enterprise maybe didn't keep going, but then you look at the impact it's had in terms of other people that learned about it and then went into government in the Philippines, and poverty reduction and so on, and the method that we use sort of filtered out in other places, but we've never really done that kind of tracing of the work. So I'm interested to see, you know, or hear how you're trying to do that with some of the participatory democracy work. I don't know whether either Josh or Ryan would like to answer.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. As a quick disclaimer, it is only my 5th week at People Powered, so I'm quite new to the work. Where we're at right now is doing more of a sort of literature review. So Josh's former organization, the Participatory Budgeting Project, has done a lot of work in terms of putting together, you know, a survey of the literature that's been done out there. And what I'm working on right now is putting that into a much more accessible format. So it's hopefully useful for scholars, but also ideally putting it together so that practitioners can access the data and in an approachable way, where if they're interested in, say, doing something with participatory budgeting, they want to try to find similar projects, or you know, maybe put together some like bullet points in the way of advocacy, they can access that data quite quickly and easily.
Yeah, and I would just add that the data that practitioners need looks very different from most academic data. It's like a sentence or two with a key data point and implications. What does that mean for me? And so a lot of our work is like translating that deeper work into something that a busy civil servant and policymaker can actually use, and having data that's relevant for them. So if all they have, if they're in Macedonia and all the data is from Brazil, it's not so useful for them for advocating for this work. So idea of like relevant data from their perspective.
Okay, Anna wanted to make a quick comment.
When I said that educating people when they get into office may be too late, I meant it actually for everybody, including us. And I was thinking about when I teach at the university at the undergrad level, I use a framework that resembles the classroom as a cooperative of workers. And so we have assemblies every single time we meet. Classes last 4 hours. I need to say that. So I have 4 hours to work with the group. But usually what the students write in their evaluations is, I didn't know I I'm going to translate it into the terms we use today, but I didn't know I could learn using direct democracy. That's sort of the concept. They don't say it in those words, but that's the meaning. So, and in the past, I worked at a cooperative of workers that held a school. So I also worked with children with this approach. That's why I do think that, actually, I think we need to live differently. We need to live a different life. Is there another life for me to live again? Gracias.
That's great. Thank you, Anna. Josh, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I put a link in the chat too, because I fully agree that we need to also bring this to classrooms and to diverse educational settings. There's so many educational spaces when people learn to not practice the things that we're advocating for. And if we can shift those educational spaces, that has such a big impact at scale. So fully agree.
Right. And that is probably a really appropriate time to finish, because it's 1 minute to our finishing time. And I see that Mariana's put a comment in there about the conversation. So we've been planning this conversation for some time. So it's fantastic to finally have done the conversation and just, you know, thought about our work a little bit more together, and you know, what might be some of the things we're interested in doing next. So I'm looking at the lovely comments. Thank you, Sadiqa, for your comment, and Lisa. So in about an hour, I guess, polls are closing in a certain part of the world, and results will be coming in. And even though elections are not the be all and end all democracy, it's certainly an important one that's going to get a lot of our attention for the next maybe week or so. So, you know, all the best for everyone as we just see what the outcome is, and look forward to seeing people either at more Ljubljana sessions or in other venues. So thanks everyone so much. Legia, you're still there. It's 1 a.m. Tom, it's midnight. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Josh, so much for contributing. Looking forward to talking more later on.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm always glad to talk more.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.